Okay, let's start. Welcome, everyone. As Yaşar University Department of Architecture, we are pleased to host a presentation by one of our department members, Assistant Professor Dr. Mauricio Morales Beltran. The title of his presentation is Preliminary Structural Reconnaissance Observations on October 30 Izmir Earthquake. I'm Ahenk Yılmaz, by the way, the head of the Department of Architecture. First of all, I would like to express my deepest condolences to those who lost their lives, their beloved ones, and their homes due to this terrible event. We prefer to organize this seminar while the effects of this earthquake are still very present, not only in our memories, but also in our built environment, in order to provide our colleagues and students with a more focused information about the effects of this earthquake on building structural system and to shed some light on the reasons behind this destruction. Without any delay, before starting the presentation, I would like to introduce Assistant Professor Dr. Beltran. Beltran is an architect and structural engineer. He received his bachelor and master degrees in his homeland, Chile, and his PhD degree in energy-based seismic design of tall buildings in TU Delft. He has a broad experience in architectural education, integrating structural design and building technology. He has been a part of Yaşar University Department of Architecture team since 2014. Now we will listen to him, Assistant Professor Dr. Mauricio Morales Beltran, and his presentation. And after the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Please prepare your questions for the end of the presentation, and there will be a discussion for them. Or you can also ask your questions by using comment boxes of Zoom or YouTube applications. I hope you a good listening. Mauricio, now the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Ahenk. And again, without no delay, I'm going to start the presentation. I hope you are hearing me well, and you are seeing my screen now. This presentation is about, firstly, a preliminary virtual report about the effects of the earthquake in not only in Izmir, but also in Greece and the island of Samos. I'm going to highlight the main observation of that preliminary report, which is produced by a number of researchers and engineers from STEER, the Structural Extreme Event Reconnaissance from the United States mostly. And secondly, I'm going to comment on, let's say, I'm going to provide a personal perspective on things that I think we need to improve as a community in order to avoid the effects of this last earthquake in Izmir, especially here. So in order to introduce the observation of the report, first I have to introduce who made this report. The STEER, it's a community of, let's say, researchers whose headquarters are in the United States, are 5 universities, University of Notre Dame, Florida, Auburn, California, and Hawaii. But this group also encompasses a lot of researchers that are around the world, and their main goal is to produce reports that can help to increase community resilience by acknowledging and by describing the effects of the earthquake in different places around the world. So because of the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, most of these reports are done lately in a virtual way. However, in this last earthquake, some of us were here, so we provide some on-field observations. So the report I'm going to show, again, I'm going to basically talk about the conclusions and the main observation. Is not of my authorship. I made a small contribution. There is a lead team from the University of California in Berkeley, and there are, as you can read here, several engineers and researchers from different places in the world that contribute to this report. So again, I want to highlight that I made a small contribution. So in the same way, what I could say today might not necessarily represent the opinion of the STEER members, is my opinion. However, the report itself, and what it comes to the 2020 Izmir earthquake, is aiming at providing details about what happened in this earthquake, describing local codes and building practices, and also providing a comparison between the records that we obtained and what the codes, seismic codes, were reporting, and basically summarize the findings about this on this assessment. And lastly, highlighting some lessons, key lessons that we learned from this earthquake. And I'm going to, again, very briefly go into this. The earthquake had an epicenter near Samos, between Samos Island and the Turkish land near Karlovasi. And the larger city affected, as probably most of you know, was Izmir. This is a shake map that shows the intensity. So as you can see here, the colors, the more red are the colors, the larger the intensity is, and the more light, the more green are, the less the intensity. So the star indicates the epicenter, and the triangles indicate where there were some instruments measuring the intensity of the earthquake. And the dots means where we receive, or we can report intensities. So even though you can see that somehow the waves are decreasing in intensity, there are amplifications, which means that in some parts, especially in Izmir, the motion, the ground motion, was amplified by local conditions. And I'm going to go back to that in a few minutes. It's estimated that the maximum ground acceleration was around 40% of the acceleration of gravity, 0.4 g. After the main earthquake, there were of course several aftershocks that were reported. But after the main earthquake, there was a small tsunami affecting both Seferihisar, the Turkish land, and also the island of Samos. This created some disruptions and some problems, let's say, to the boats, but there was no major disruptions at the level of the community resilience. At the same time, in the island of Samos, there were some collapsed buildings, mostly old masonry and adobe houses, as you can see here in the pictures. There were also some damages to church and all buildings. This one you can see is a church in Karlovasi and the island of Samos. There were several school buildings with non-structural damage. So out of 44 schools, 11 of them reported this type of damage. That is not really a severe damage, but at the end of the day, because you have non-structural damage, these buildings cannot be reoccupied immediately. And as you know, unfortunately, the major consequence in terms of damage were in Izmir. 17 buildings fully collapsed in this earthquake, some of them really quick during the earthquake. In a preliminary damage assessment that was conducted in the first week of November by the Turkish Ministry of Environment and Urbanization on 10,000, around 10,000 buildings in Izmir. 124 were tagged as having heavy damage, 118 as having moderate damage, and then around 700 with light and 9,000 with no damage. Although that might provide a somehow successful, let's say, performance in terms of numbers, because 90% of the building presented no damage. The reality is we still have 17 buildings that collapse. And I have heard that around 500 buildings now need to be either demolished or retrofit, which is a very, very large number. In the report, we realize, we put here, we wrote that actually, because it was discovered in that way, that there was a significant side amplification in the area of Bayrakli, which is where this picture is taken from. And some people speculate that that was the reasons for some of the buildings to collapse, that there was a side amplification because of the soft soil, and that increased the motion, and therefore there were some buildings collapsing. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove you that whereas it's true that the soft soil amplifies the motion, and that is something we already knew from long before. I mean, this is a very well-known fact for seismic engineers, that the soft soil is going to increase the ground motion. There is in no way that can justify that buildings are going to collapse. So I'm going to prove you that. But before going there, I need to introduce very shortly for the people who is not, let's say, doesn't have knowledge in seismic engineering. I need to introduce two basic, let's say, concepts. One is the period of a building that we call T. And the period of a building is, in very simple ways, the number of seconds that it takes for the building to naturally vibrate back and forth. So if you somehow are able to push the building, displace the building, and then let it naturally vibrate, the time that is going to take to move forward and back and forward, is what we call period. And it's a very important parameter in seismic engineering. All the buildings, no matter how many stories have, no matter if it's one story of a tall building, all buildings have a natural period of vibration. Now, there is a rule of thumb that tells that we can initially calculate this period by taking the number of floors and divide it over 10, divided by 10. This, of course, is not accurate. This doesn't mean that you can just take the number of floors and immediately determine the period of this building, but it's a good approximation. There are changes for that, but it's a good approximation. So if we look at most of the buildings that collapse, we will realize that they were between 8 and 10 stories, which again, using this rule of thumb, means that we have between 0.8 and 1 second natural period of building. So the second concept I have to introduce is something called design spectra, or sometimes design spectrum. And this is an example, which I took from the paper whose reference is given here underneath. And the design spectra is a tool that engineers use in order to estimate the structural response as a function of the building period. So if you look at the x-axis here, you're going to see different periods. You're going to see 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, and 3. And in the vertical axis, you're going to have something that is called pseudo acceleration. I don't want to go deep in there, but let's say that the vertical axis shows a different level of acceleration. So basically, this design spectra is showing an envelope of a predicted behavior of a building according to the period. So for example, if we have a building of 5 stories, we expect this building to be within this envelope, and we are going to design that envelope, that building, to fit in this envelope. If we have a building of 10 stories, that envelope will decrease, and if we keep rising the height, that envelope will be smaller and smaller. The envelope, in turn, depends on the type of soil. So for example, if you bear with me and look at here at this green, you will see that actually what it's saying is that for a period of 5 stories, the demand or the way, the response we should design the building is going to be, for example, for a 5-story, is going to be around this point. However, if the soil conditions decrease, if they are worse, then the demand is bigger, and that is what you have here. So then the envelope becomes bigger and bigger. So by looking at this, you can deduce that the soil A, whatever it is much more stronger than the soil E, which is here at the upper part. Why? Because that soil, the last one, is demanding more, let's say, capacity of the structure. So I can say that probably this soil A is rock, whereas this one is soft soil. Now, the important part is this one. The important part is that this design spectra is basically a prediction tool and allow us to estimate the structural response of a building as a function of the building period. Now I'm going to show you this, which is a figure that appears in the report, in which we compare this design spectrum versus the response spectra. So to clarify this, again, to make it understandable to everyone that is listening, I need to, with your permission, to concentrate first in the design spectrum. And what you're going to see here, this blue line here, is the, let's say, prediction or the demand that was defined according to the Turkish building seismic code of the 2018, the last one, the one that is currently in function. And then you see the same code, but with the orange line, which is this one. It represents soft soil. And then you see 2 other lines that are almost overlapping each other here, which represent the soft soil conditions in 1975 and 2007. In simple words, what you're looking at here are the structural response, the estimated structural response for soft soils according to different codes, especially if you look at these 3. So according to these 3, this was the structural response we were estimating for soft soil, actually according to the Turkish code. Now I want to show you this, which is a record of an acceleration at Bayrakli, in the place where many buildings collapse. Here you can see that the main motion took around 39 or 40 seconds. And with these motions, with several of these motions, we create something that is called the response spectra, which is, again, estimating the structural response according to several records, in this case, real record. And that response spectra is what you see here, the other part of the graph. And again, if you bear with me, let's go here. So you see a green line here, which in the dark blue, which shows the rock response or the acceleration, the ground motion according to different periods, 1 second, 2 seconds, when the soil was much more strong rock. And as I said before, as it was predicted, in soft soil, which is these two here, the accelerations are larger. And for periods around 1, probably 1.5 or 0.8, these accelerations are very, very large. Now, again, if we look at buildings that collapse, they were around 8 stories, 9 stories height. So we trace this line here, which represents more or less the period. This could be more to the right or more to the left. This is not accurate, but it's just to give you a clear answer of what I was saying before. So we are going to intersect all these envelopes at a certain point, and I want you to look at this point because these points represent in the upper part the expected acceleration for a soft soil according to the seismic codes of 1975 and 2007. These other points represent the expected ground accelerations according to the code in 2018. And here, in this intersection, it could be a little bit higher, but it doesn't matter because these are the real accelerations we recorded on the day of the earthquake. And you can see that these are not even close. In other words, the accelerations we measure were even much lower than the expected acceleration for soft soil. So first of all, the argument that the buildings collapsed because they were in a soft soil is not true, because they should have been designed in a way that they should be considering this soft soil. So the second important conclusion here is that if any of these buildings, all these buildings actually, had been designed according to any version of the code, they will not be expected to collapse. None of them should have collapsed. So I also heard some people saying that some buildings collapsed because they were designed according to an older version of the code. That's not true. Whatever version you use for any of these buildings, they will have never collapsed. So why they did collapse then? Again, this is going to require some time. I know there are some testing going on, but and we need to wait for forensic engineering to tell us exactly what happened with these buildings. But if they didn't collapse, I mean, if the Turkish code was enough at any of these versions to provide capacity, strong capacity to these buildings, we can guess that this building collapsed probably because they have structural and material related deficiencies. So recommendations from the report. The first one is the effects of site amplification, or in simple words, the effect of this soft soil. These need to be explored further to address how much they can increase the motion in larger future earthquake. And this is important because a new earthquake is going to come sooner or later, and we have to consider this situation. Some of the researchers and engineers, among which I personally consider, we think that most of this damage were initiated by infill wall failures. I'm going to explain this a little bit later, but of course, again, this is only speculation until we know exactly what happened with this building, it's always going to be. So if we will have an early warning, an earthquake early warning system, we could have known that an earthquake happened around 50 seconds before actually the earthquake reaches this area, narrow window. But if you have a community that knows what to do in the case of an earthquake, 15 seconds might make some difference. So it's suggested that this earthquake early warning system should be implemented. As I understand that it's implemented already in Istanbul, but probably we also need it here, especially in large cities. Since there are so many buildings that need to be retrofit, it's also recommendable to use some protective systems, namely base isolation or supplemental damping. And again, a very consistent and comprehensive evaluation and assessment of the buildings need to be done in Izmir, and also a proper strategies for retrofitting those buildings. And I'm going to move now to a personal perspective of things we need to do. And I'm going to start like this. This is a picture of a former two-story house whose ground floor was completely collapsed. As you can see in this picture, this is the 2007 earthquake in Tocopilla, in a city in Chile. And at that time, I was doing my master, and I remember a former professor. She told me, if you want to learn about seismic engineering, you should go and learn from the effects of the earthquake. So this was my first experience after an earthquake, visiting and trying to learn from the effects of the earthquake on buildings. And well, I've been in other earthquakes. And I want to show you again this record, which shows the ground motion in function of the time. And as I said before, the ground motion here was around 40 seconds, which is what you see there. And you will understand why it's so small in a minute. And I heard a lot of people telling me, of course, in a casual fashion. I'm using their words. I thought I will die. I talked to some people that were in the buildings. I live in the area of Bayrakli, so I talked with friends and students who were around this area or in the building, in the university. But the people who was here in the buildings, some of people told me, I thought I'm gonna die in this earthquake. And I have the feeling that for some people, this was the most scariest experience ever. And I have bad news, because wasn't a large earthquake, it was an average moderate earthquake. And another one like this one, or even larger, will come. When, we don't know, but definitely will come. And is up to us how much we're going to be prepared for that. So in order to put that in a kind of more proper comparison, I'm going to show you now an earthquake in Chile, which happened in 2010, and it was a magnitude 8.9, and the duration of that earthquake was around 3 minutes, 180 seconds, which is what you see here. And the acceleration of the ground was almost twice the acceleration of the ground you felt here. And you might think, well, that's very long, and that is a lot of acceleration. And let me show you the last one, which is the Japanese earthquake 1 year after the other. And it was 5 long minutes of ground shaking. And with accelerations that reach 1G, which is the acceleration of gravity, but in this case, affecting the building horizontally. That is a lot of motion, and is a lot of time in which the building keep shaking. Now I'm going to stick with the Chilean earthquake for a while, just to make a point about this. So this happened on February in 2010. I was not there, just in case this is important information. I was not right there in the place where it happened, but then I traveled to see the effects. So this earthquake affected 80% of the population of the country, generate a blackout that affected more than 90% of the population. It triggered, of course, a tsunami. And this is important as well. Every earthquake that occurs on the sea, whatever the sea is going to generate a tsunami. That is a rule. So this was that not only affected our own country, but also affected many other countries, 53 countries around the Pacific Ocean. Even this tsunami created damage in countries like Japan. Really, 525 people lost their lives, unfortunately. And almost 9% of the population in the area that was affected by the earthquake lost their homes. And as you can imagine, the economy losses in Chile was quite large. So this is a very dark picture of an earthquake that affected 90% of the Chilean population, which means affect a lot of cities, major cities in the country. And I want to ask you, based on the experience you had here in this earthquake, how many buildings do you think fully collapse in this very, very large earthquake in Chile? And before you go further with this answer, I'm going to tell you how many. Only this one. This was the only building that fully collapsed in that earthquake. Of course, were other buildings that had partial collapse or need to be demolished afterwards. I'm not saying that wasn't like this, but only one building collapsed completely during the earthquake. Unfortunately, of course, there were people dead here. Now, you can ask me, what was the difference? What's the difference then? Are you more prepared? Do you have better engineering? And I would say, no, it's not about that. The reason why in Chile we had only, and what you have here, you also in some buildings use shear walls, but you much. Here in Turkey, you use a lot of moment resistant frames. And the main difference of between a moment frame and a shear wall, when it comes to seismic resistance, is that the moment frame, as you can see in the images that are to the left, resists by dissipating energy on the nodes. So in the nodes, so all the resistance of the frames, nodes in the connection. So that small area is the one that is in charge to give total resistance to the building. In a shear wall, is the whole volume of the shear wall. Sorry. So when it comes to dissipate the energy, remember that an earthquake is energy. You all felt, or most of you felt, that energy going through the building, and the building vibrates because it's dissipating the energy. So when the energy is too large, when the earthquake is too large, the only way that the energy can be dissipated is by creating cracks, by fracturing, in this case, the reinforced concrete. So if you have a small area, actually a small volume, the crack is going to appear very soon. If you have a bigger volume, at the end, the crack is going to take longer to appear. And moreover, when you have a node of a frame that is already broken, the entire structural resistance of the building is compromised. Whereas, as you can see in the picture to the right, even though the shear wall is fully collapsed, I mean, the concrete is fully destroyed, you can still rely on that to support the building. So do I think that the engineers here in moment frame here in Turkey? No. I don't think in that could be done. The problem is, and I will clarify this, the problem is not the engineering. The problem is, if we keep looking at the problem as a problem of engineering,
Dear Hocam, can you hear us?
yeah. Yes, I think there was a problem. I lost my connection.
We lost your connection for several times, but there were small cuts. We didn't want to interrupt, but are you able to continue now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me right now?
There are small problems still going on, but let's give it a try.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you are sharing your screen right now. We see the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, let me try to change my connection. Maybe that can help.
Yeah, it can really help right now.
One second, I'm going to try to change my connection.
In the meantime, I would like to remind everyone again, if you have any question, you can just directly use the chat box or comment box. You can do it either on Zoom or on YouTube live channel. So you can just write down your question and Mauricio will answer them at the end of the presentation. Mauricio, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah, great.
I changed now I hope it's going to work. I'm really sorry.
Your sound is much better.
Yeah, I changed the connection. Sometimes it's a problem. I'm really sorry. I'm going to continue from here. I hope it's fine. In anyways, if there was something that was not really clear, you can always ask me at the end. I want to clarify this part. I was saying that the reason why I'm insisting on using shear walls is not because I think there is no proper engineering that is able to design moment frames that can resist earthquake. I want to insist on that. In Turkey, you have engineers that can design proper moment resistant system for earthquakes. But the problem is not engineers. The problem is not engineering. The problem is when we do things like this one, which is when you have regular people adding things to the houses or building houses on their own or changing things in the configuration of the apartments. So the problem is this, the problem is not the engineering. So the problem is the people is copying what they see, what they have learned. So if they don't understand that the moment frames need to be designed properly and the way they have to be designed, you have really little in the sense of providing structural resistance. Again, in Chile, in countries like Chile, there are also people that copy the things and they don't know exactly how to do it, but because everyone does it with walls, there is more redundancy in the system to resist earthquake. But here, when people try to copy what they see, which are moment frames everywhere, and they do it wrong, they are exposed to the problems we have seen, unfortunately, in this last earthquake. So people might think that they can remove a column when there is a problem. But if you have shear walls, it will be really complicated for them to just simply remove a shear wall. So again, my insistence in using shear walls is not because I think the engineers of this country cannot design proper moment frames, is because most of the people is going to understand that they should design and they should build using shear walls. My point, and I'm going to start making this point here, is that the community must be involved in the decision-making process, which is what I was saying, in the decision of how we build, in the decision of how we change the structural system. As I said before, I personally think that most of the problems here in Turkey are related with a problem called soft story. So in order to introduce that very shortly, that soft story problem, let me show you this, which is in the upper part, let's say a regular 4-story buildings. Of course, this is a scheme. So if this is designed correctly, when you have an earthquake force, there will be a drift, which is basically a lateral displacement. And that drift is going to be distributed homogeneously along the height. So each of the story is displacing a bit. So you have the total drift. In a soft story, very simple, is that for some reason, one story is more flexible than the others. That is the name coming from, soft. So one story, for some reason, is more soft, more flexible than the others. So that single floor is going to take all the drift, which is here. And because that single floor takes all the drift, there is a lot of concentration of stress in those elements, and therefore those elements collapse because they reach the maximum level of stress very quickly. And in this case, in this image, again, this scheme, the reason why we have soft story is because the ground floor is taller than the other ones. But in Turkey, the soft story occur because usually between the first floor and whatever is the top story, we have residential functions. Namely, we have houses, we have apartments, we have a lot of infill walls because, of course, people want privacy, but we take out those infill walls in the ground floor. This is a image of one of the buildings that collapsed. And you can see here something that is very, very regular and very common landscape in Turkey, not only in this city, but in many cities, which is this mixed-use building. In the ground floor, we have commercial areas, and in the upper part, we have residential areas. So in the ground floor, people do not want walls. They want opening, they want flexibility. So we have only columns. But in the upper floors, because we want privacy, we connect these columns with infill walls. Now, what is the problem with that? The problem is, although the infill walls are not supposed to be structural, they are helping the columns to resist the lateral displacement. So what happens is that all this block here, all the upper part works as a one thing, is very stiff, whereas in the ground floor, it's only supported by column. And that is called soft story. So the soft story is the consequence of that, because when the earthquake comes, all the stress is concentrated in the columns of the ground floor, and then the building falls over these columns. And now you can say, okay, but that is might be your hypothesis or your belief, maybe it's not, it was not really like that. And I would say, yeah, maybe that could be, but it's nothing new. This same phenomenon, the same mechanism was observed in an earthquake in 1998, and I'm only talking about Turkey, in 1999, as you very well know, in 2003, and 2011 in the last earthquake we know. So this is a very well-known mechanism happening over and over in Turkey, because it's is related with a building topology, which is again upper floors, residential, commercial areas, and the ground floor. And you can tell, and I heard some engineers that said, okay, so we can retrofit these buildings, so we can give them more stiffness in the ground floor. For example, here to the left, by adding some buttresses to increase the strength, or by adding bracings, like here in the middle, or by adding more columns, like here in the last one. However, whereas these different options might work from the structural perspective, can you imagine trying to convince the owner of these places that we have to put a brace here for their own safety, or that we have to put these columns? So in order to achieve a proper solution, in a solution that's going to be implemented and is going to be there when the next earthquake comes, we need to consider the owners and users' opinions. We cannot decide on our own. So we've been working in a project, in a research project, about a solution for this. I don't want to talk about that solution because I think it's not the topic of this lecture, but I want to say that one way we devise as for asking the opinions of the users, it was by creating these surveys. So we put, as you see here, several images, and then we ask them, which one would you prefer, and which one would you feel more safe, and which one do you prefer for, like here, for a bedroom, which one would you prefer for a living room, and so on and so forth. So there are ways in which you can collect the opinion, you can take their preferences, and then with that information, you can provide solutions incorporating their preferences. And then you can tell me, yeah, but still, this solution should be structural sound. And I would say yes, but if you don't incorporate the users, they might reject these solutions and might simply not applying them. And then we're going to have the same effect that we just see, that the buildings are going to have a lot of damage because these retrofitting solutions are not being accepted by the users because they don't match what they do in a daily life. So we need to incorporate them in order to have solutions that are going to be accepted by the users, and they are going to provide earthquake resistance. In the last part, this is the last part of the presentation, I want to address the last element I think we need to tackle as a community, which is education. In the university and in the Department of Architecture, we've been working since 2014 providing this course, which is called earthquake resistant buildings, and for some years was associated to a design studio. And basically here we try to introduce architects in the subject of seismic design. So we use different strategies. Here in the left, you have an exercise addressing the problem of torsion. In the middle, you have an exercise trying to clarify the importance of the location of the, let's say, the holes or the penetrations you are going to make on the diaphragms. And the last picture is a shaking table. It's a handmade shaking table where the students were testing some models to understand torsion, to understand soft story, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to talk, I'm not going to talk for the sake of the time about different strategies, but of course I'm always available if someone wants to know more about these strategies. However, I want to address one question that was very often asked to me, which is why architects need to know about this seismic design principle, why we need to tell them, why we need to teach them. I think that most of the people, even some colleagues, some architects, think that seismic design is a subject for engineers. However, and these are my answers, you will be surprised that how much the early design decisions affect the seismic performance of a building. So here I have two pictures. If you look at the picture of the big building, all the facade and all these decisions were made by architects, not by engineers. And for good or for bad, all these decisions are going to affect the performance of these buildings. And this building collapsed. Is one of the buildings that collapsed. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this building collapsed because of the architectural decisions, but certainly whatever we do as design at the beginning is going to have an influence in the performance of the building. So this picture here depicts a very traditional, I would say, open ground floor, probably for a tea area. And again, if the architects keep designing open ground floors and where there are really little amount of structural elements, then the engineer have little as well range to provide seismic response in the system. So there is this need to combine the effort. We need to understand some design principles in order to provide solutions that match our architectural design ideas, but also matching the logic of the seismic design. The second reason is because architects are the ultimate responsible of whatever happens with the building. And that is especially true for the non-structural detailing. The engineer, if you look at the picture to the left, the engineer is not responsible of the ceiling, nor its collapse, but this damage and whatever this damage might create economic loss or injury on people is responsibility of the architect. The distribution of the function, namely the furniture as well. Here you can see some shelves. By the way, these pictures are from the courthouse in Izmir, and were taken by Professor Ozjelik from DocuSailor, and these pictures appears in the report, so I took them from there. And also, architects are responsible of the non-structural damage. I mean, that is not a responsibility we can give to the engineers. This is responsibility of the architect. The third reason, and this is more towards the future, is that I personally believe that seismic design principle might become an opportunity to explore new paths in architecture. And this is important because when we understand or we follow the seismic design principles, for example, here you have different seismic resistance systems, and then we apply literally let's say, the suggestion of an optimal structural system, which are here, okay, continuous load path, equal floor heights, identical vertical resistance, uniform sections, no cantilever, no openings, diaphragm, and so on. When we follow all these suggestions, all these, let's say, attributes of an optimal system, then we ended up with earthquake resistant buildings, but we might not ended up with architecture. So the question is, do we prefer to build this one, or we will prefer to follow these principles and find a way in which we can follow this, but in a more creative way? And I always show this one. The colleagues who were my students or are my students now in the class, probably they have seen this building a couple of times, because it's one of those I show very often. This is a building in Japan, so it's in a seismic country, that was designed as an inspiration. It was inspired by the trees that are in the street. If you look at the picture, you will see that in front there is a silhouette of a tree, and that was the inspiration for the architect. He took this branch distribution thing, it kind of distributed along the facade, and then he created this arrangement. However, if we take something called topology optimization, which is the right distribution of material according to a predefined set of loadings, and if you look at here at the middle, and we do something like this, we take an area and then we apply a triangular pattern, loading pattern like this one. Surprisingly, you're going to obtain optimized forms that looks like this one to the right inside, this one here. In other words, this is an optimized distribution of material for something that can be understood as an earthquake load pattern, which, not surprisingly, reminds very much of what the architect did here. Of course, the engineers were aware of this one, but this is, to me, a very good example where you can combine structural knowledge, seismic knowledge with architectural creativity for achieving something that fulfills the requirement of seismic design, but at the same time is a completely new architectural work. The fourth reason is because architects can improve community resilience by designing public facilities that can have a post-disaster function. For example, this is also a picture of Izmir. These tents were provided as a temporary shelter for the people who lost their homes. But what, for example, if we design the schools as a post-disaster management centers? In the schools, in a secondary school or any school, you have already all the facilities. You have heating systems, you have ventilation systems, you have running water, you have electricity. So what if we design the schools for normal times to work as a school, and then in the crisis time, in the emergency time, they can become a shelter? And that can be designed by architects. And of course, that also need to be considered in the case of the extreme cause that brings demolishing the buildings, because when we don't consider these, we are going to have hopefully buildings that do not collapse, but they are so damaged that need to be demolished, and that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of money. And lastly, we need to educate the community. It's not only about architects, it's not only about the university. We need to teach the community. I mean, not we, the whole community need to also address education at different levels. These are two images of evacuation drills in my country. On the left side, you see a drill that is showing the students, is teaching the students how to behave during an earthquake. So they find shelter under the tables. And then in the right side, you see after the earthquake, there is a tsunami alarm. So the people have to leave the buildings and then they have to go to a security areas. And that is happening very often. And then you train the people. So when the earthquake, when the one that we experienced last a couple of weeks ago happened, then people is prepared already, or most of the people is prepared already to know what to do. I think the most common feeling after an earthquake, apart from fear, is panic. And after that is not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go. There was a huge traffic bottleneck everywhere. I mean, people was trying to leave the city here, and the traffic couldn't move, the cars couldn't move, and that is because there was no planning, there was no preparedness. So education should be also addressing that. And I'm going to finish here with some sort of reflection, a personal reflection. This is a picture I took the day after the earthquake. I went early in the morning to one of the buildings that collapsed. And my goal, in my mind, the idea was to take some pictures and try to understand from my perspective what happened with this building. And of course, I found the people who was trying to recover, to find people alive under the debris. So yeah, I came at the moment when a person was asking through the speaker to keep to remain silent, so they could hear if there was anyone there talking or asking for help. So of course we all stood there in silence, and I start to think at this point that no matter how much knowledge I might have, no matter how much experience I might have at that point, everything there was useless. I couldn't help in any way. I couldn't do anything. And you only stand there just hoping for these people from the rescue teams that they are going to find more people alive. But by the way, if there is any of from this rescue team, I want to thank you for your very brave altruism and extraordinary work in finding people. But this is an invitation to learn the lesson. This is an invitation to understand that our work shouldn't finish here. When this happens, we are done. We cannot do anything. So our work is before this happens. And now the clock starts to run again. The next earthquake is going to come. And it's not a matter of what if the earthquake comes, it's a matter of when. The earthquake will come and it will be much stronger than this one, maybe not, but we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared before this. So we need to work in design. So now I want to invite you to ask questions or comments. I know you might disagree with me in certain aspects. I will be happy to hear from you, but let's agree on something. Let's not this happen again. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. We all hope that it will not happen again, but you are right, indicating that it will happen. It's just a question of matter of when. So now I would like to ask the others if they do have any questions. In fact, Matthew wrote two questions. Let me read them first and we can start the discussion from there. The first question, how to understand the reason why building collapse if there is no building anymore to inspect? How you can do that? That's the question. And the second one, what about the infill walls? Once they are now broken or cracked, should they be changed? Those are two questions.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Well, to answer the first one, I am not really, it's not really my field of expertise. This is about something called forensic engineering, which of course again, requires maybe someone from that field is listening, maybe they can explain a little bit more. What I do know, in my little knowledge about that, is that they take samples. So for example, if one of the hypotheses is that the material was not proper. So for example, they didn't put the right amount of cement, or there was a lot of salt in the mixture. So what they do, Matthew, is that they take samples. They take samples of material, and then they conduct testing materials, and then they can determine the quality of this material to find out whether there was enough strength in the material itself. Now, to find out which type of structural mistakes were made, that probably requires more, let's say, more investigation with, I don't know, former pictures or interviews with the people to know, for example, if they remove, it was a column that was removed or something like that. I really cannot know beyond that. And the second question about the infill walls, the good things about the infill walls is that you can remove them completely and then replace them, because it's non-structural. So as long as there is non-structural damage, you can always change that. Of course, that comes with a lot of money involved, because you have to rebuild things, but you can repair this one. Again, in a research project we are suggesting that we should not connect the infill walls with the structural system. There should be a gap. Well, actually, in the Turkish seismic code, it's written as well. It's suggested that the infill walls should not be connected with the structural frame. So when you have deformations, the frame is going to deflect without affecting the infill wall. So in that way, you won't have any damage.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other question from our listeners, or I'm checking the YouTube if there is any. I guess no question right now. There is a question by Meltem Hoca. How important is the age of a building? I guess especially in terms of structural system, especially in reinforced concrete.
That is an interesting question. I think you still can see my screen. I want to go back to this. In seismic design, the aging of the materials is considered, and at the same time, let's say time influences of the performance we are expecting in the building in relationship with what is the probability that that building is going to be affected by a large earthquake. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to design a building that is going to be there for 100 years, depending on depending on the region that is going to be located, we might expect a very large earthquake affecting that building, because the time span of that building is very, very long. If I'm going to design a building that I'm expecting it to be there for 10 years, which is never the case, but let's say we put it in this way, probably I can assume that the probability that that building is going to be affected by a very large earthquake in 10 years is very low. So depending on that, I'm going to, depending on other factors as well, but depending on that, I can define and decide which type of performance I'm going to expect from that building. Now, when you do that, you consider that the materials are going to age, the materials can deteriorate, but never at the point to jeopardize or to compromise the structural safety of the building. So in other words, even though in engineering you work with performance levels, never ever in any design you should put the performance level at the point that the building might collapse, and that includes the lifetime of the building. So what I'm trying to say is, from that perspective, it doesn't really matter how old is the building, because still it should have resist any earthquake. And I'm coming back to this image because something that is surprising here is that in the old code, namely 1975, there was a larger expectations of accelerations than in the new code. And what this earthquake is showing is that probably there will be a new version of the seismic codes, at least for this area, in which this orange envelope is going to extend this curve a little bit further to incorporate these large accelerations here that you can see here. These bumps need to be incorporated because now they are too close. So probably what is going to happen is it's going to go back to the old code in that regard. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that if correctly designed, all buildings might have larger, might tolerate larger acceleration than a new building, if they were designed correctly according to the codes. So again, answering the question is not important. It doesn't matter as long as the buildings were designed according to any code. That is the main conclusion here.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from YouTube. Let me read it for you. The person who asks the question is İrem İnce. And her question is, there are different lines. Let me read all of them. Thank you very much for this nice presentation. I would like to ask one question regarding risky areas in İzmir. Law 6306, disaster law, designates risky areas. In İzmir, none of the risky areas designated by this law were structurally damaged during the earthquake. I would like to ask, how could you define the risky areas in İzmir? Do you consider the Bayraklı district as risky area due to its ground structure? I don't know if it's your expertise, but that's the question.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I really don't have much knowledge of how those areas were defined. What I do know is that in the case of Bayraklı, there were studies addressing that the soft soil here was a factor, and it will be a factor in a major earthquake. I mean, there were previous studies. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the studies do not match, let's say, the regulations by the authority, and that is something that is completely beyond my knowledge. I cannot talk about that because I honestly don't know. So yeah, it's little what I can say about these risk zones. What I do know, of course, is that every seismic code, this is always the case, every seismic code, every zone, risk zone definition, every regulation changes after a major disaster. For example, I was showing the earthquakes in Chile and Japan. After those, we had to change the regulations. We have to change the code. Why? Because we learn from the experience. So yeah, it might have happened that these risk areas didn't have any collapse or any problem, but it's not because they are not really risky. It's because this particular earthquake might not have affected those areas, but affected Bayraklı. So now Bayraklı is going to be a risk area. In the next earthquake, this, depending on the ground motion, this new earthquake might not affect Bayraklı, it might affect another one. That is important. That is why it's very important, and one is one of the recommendations, that there should be a comprehensive assessment not only in Bayrakli now, because Bayrakli was the most affected just for this one, but we don't know the next one. So it should be an assessment over the entire city to detect these potential areas, risk areas, and then a consistent retrofitting system, application system to keep this in the safe area. So that is what I can say so far.
Okay, thank you. There is now another question. It says Tartugo Sairo, maybe you know him, I don't know him. Hi bro, there is a minimum energy, Richter scale, that a building has to resist from an earthquake. Or is it just a decision from the ones who build it? It exists some law or regulation about that?
No, okay, if I understand correctly, and sorry if I don't, but if I am understanding correctly, let's clarify this. Energy is what it enters the building on purpose of the motion. So the building has to dissipate the energy, and the way it does it is again by vibrating. So when this energy is too much in, let's say, reinforced concrete buildings, we're going to have damage, and that is how we dissipate the energy. So how much damage? Let's now make energy equals to damage. How much damage we are going to tolerate in the building, again, depends on certain parameters. But I would say the more important one is function. So this is how it works. Let's say you have to design a building which is going to be a residential building. And then they are going to call, let's say it's going to be designed for you. So the engineer is going to call you and going to say, okay, look, we can design it for resisting an earthquake that is going to come. The probability that this earthquake is going to come is less than 1% in 100 years. But in order to do that, we need to spend a lot of money because we need to reinforce the building and create a lot of redundancy in the structure. So that is going to cost you a lot. Or we can design it for an earthquake that is not going to be that strong, but it might come in 50 years. So then it's going to be a, let's say, then the seismic resistance of that building is going to cost less. So these are the level of performance, but you never put the level of performance at the level that is going to, again, compromise the safety of the owner, of the people that live there. Sorry, there is a microphone open somewhere. What I was saying is that, so that is the level of performance that we put. So in some, what defines there is a little bit more, I mean, mostly is the function, because whereas if this is a residential building and I can accept that if there is a very large earthquake, I can have a little damage. For example, if the building is going to be a hospital, or is going to be a fire station, or is going to be a police station, I cannot tolerate any damage in an earthquake. Why? Because these are primary functions that are especially needed when the earthquake comes. So, whereas I might design buildings using the same philosophy, I'm going to design a building that has a primary function to tolerate the maximum level of energy that can be dissipated. So that building is going to remain functional right after the earthquake. Whereas in other buildings, I can tolerate a certain degree of damage because between those, there is a variation of the cost. So again, that depends on the function, that depends on how much money the user wants to pay, but none of these should jeopardize or compromise the structural integrity of the building. Namely, they should never put in risk the people who live in those buildings.
Thank you very much. There are two more questions. Let me ask them. İpek Hoca is asking a question. The buildings in adjacent order and attached to each other by a side, do they also affect each other in a way to cause the collapse? A kind of whipping effect I was asking about actually. This is by İpek Hoca. I'm going to tell the other later.
Okay, so yes, there is something called pounding effect. Which is usually when you have buildings, we saw it here, very common. When you have buildings of different heights, they move in a different way, they behave in a different way. So because they are together, they start clashing each other. Now, there was I saw a little bit of damage and then region, the adjacent region, which is kind of expected because usually it's the facade or the plaster that covers the facade. So yeah, answering your question, yes, it does, it produces a negative effect sometimes, usually when you have different heights. But in other cases, I think the fact that you have stuck the buildings, it helps because then they support each other. So usually in the seismic code, it's advisable to create a seismic gap, which is you give enough space to the buildings to vibrate without clashing each other. But yeah, in Turkey, most of the buildings are stuck each other, and I think in some cases it helps when we're together because they help each other to dissipate the energy.
I wasn't expecting that answer, by the way.
No.
I always thought that it was something negative.
It is negative again. I mean, if you ask, probably any engineers will say we need to separate them. But I realize that that sometimes it helps, and not surprisingly, all the buildings that collapsed were isolated. I mean, you saw a lot of older buildings that were. I was looking at them and I was asking how this building did not collapse because it was in very bad shape, but you see other buildings next to it, so you know maybe this building is resistant, maybe also is resistant, so it helps. Okay, it's not advisable, it's a little bit as a gamble, but it works. So I want to make clear that sometimes it works.
That's very interesting. Another question, Pamir Genç is asking, what is the importance of the water isolation below ground level? In parentheses, protection of steel reinforcement in the foundation, basement and ground floor reinforced concrete elements.
Well, there are I guess two problems with water. One is that if you have water in the soil, let's say underground, in the foundations, there is a phenomenon called liquefaction, which is in the presence of acceleration, the water simply is going to rise, it's going to go up, and the soil is going to go down. So then the entire building could go down, which is not really much a problem if it does it homogeneously. But again, the soil is never an homogeneous area. So usually what happens is the building tilt, and then of course might be a collapse. So liquefaction is a very dangerous problem. I heard from one of the engineers who I was working with in the structural assessment in the week after the earthquake. He told me that he thinks he saw in one of the buildings, he saw water rising from the ground in one of the buildings, heavily damaged in Bayrakli. So liquefaction might also have been involved in some of the damage of the buildings, but of course I cannot confirm that. Now, the other problem with water at any point, but especially in the ground for reinforced concrete, is that water always finds its way. So it's going to reach the steel and it's going to create some rust. And that process is going to, of course, weaken the steel. So we found a lot of damage that was originated, structural damage that was originated by, let's say, oxidation or rusting of the steel element, the rebars in reinforced concrete. So yeah, it's a problem for that, and it should be protected. The foundations and the ground floor, so we, especially in reinforced concrete, should be always protected from the water. So there are, you know, building systems that you can use, paint that you can use to protect them from the water, but it's always a problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm checking if there is any other question that I didn't retell. Actually, I don't see any right now. Yeah. Seems to me like you answered all of them.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Is there anything that you would like to add as a kind of a, you know, last words?
I would like to insist in the idea of invitation. As I said, maybe to some people, I really, one of the reasons I came to Turkey, well, the reason why I came to Turkey was to let's say, I wouldn't, to do something about this issue. I knew an earthquake was coming. I knew it could happen in any area, not necessarily in Izmir. I was invited to this country and to this very, very nice city. For that was the reason why I came here. And the day of the earthquake, I was very, very angry and I was very sad. I think those were my emotions that day, because I felt that there is too much to do, and I personally did very little. So I think I think we have a lesson to learn here. And again, this is an invitation, and the reason why we're making this is to raise awareness. And if anyone that is listening now would like to do something about that, or would like to help in any way, they can always contact me or contact the people who organize this in the faculty and or in the department. Because yeah, we have to do this. I don't want the next earthquake to come and being just a witness of this terrible situation, this tragedy. This shouldn't have happened, and I really hope it's not going to happen again. So if, again, it's an invitation to all the people who is listening. If anyone wants to help to avoid that, I'll be welcome to listen their words or ideas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these words and your presentation, and especially for your invitation. I think it's very important, and hope to see all of you in better days. Thank you very much for the listeners for attendance. See you all. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.